October 15th in the evening, continued from page 181. All Souls' Day that year was different from usual. The weather was certainly appropriate. It had changed abruptly, and the late heat had given way overnight to chills. As in other years, a cold winter was now blowing continuously. Large clouds sped up from one end of the horizon to the other, casting shadows over the houses before the cold golden light of November returned to them after the clouds had passed by. The first Macintoshes made their appearance, but one could also see a surprising number of shiny, rubberized materials. The newspapers reported that 200 years earlier, in the great plagues of the south of France, doctors used to wear oilcloth for their own protection. The shops took advantage of this to unload a supply of cloths that were no longer in fashion, and from which everyone hoped to gain immunity. However, all these seasonal indicators could not disguise the fact that the cemeteries were deserted. In other years, the trams had been full of the vapid scent of chrysanthemums, and processions of women making their way to the places where their loved ones were buried to put flowers on their graves. This had been the day when people had tried to make up to the dead for leaving them alone and forgetting them for many long months. But that year, no one wanted to think about the dead, for the very reason that they had already been thinking too much about them. It was no longer a matter of going back to see them with a little remorse and lots of melancholy. They were no longer the forgotten ones whom one visited in self-justification one day a year. They were the intruders about whom one would rather forget. This is why the feast of the dead that year was somewhat brushed aside. Thoreau noticed that Cottard's language was becoming more and more ironic. According to him, every day was a feast of the dead. Indeed, the bonfires of the plague burned ever more cheerfully in the crematorium. Admittedly, the number of dead from one day to the next was not rising, but it seemed that the plague had settled comfortably into its peak and was carrying out its daily murders with the procession and regularity of a good civil servant. In theory, in the opinion of experts, this was a good sign. The graph of the progression of the plague, starting with its constant rise followed by its long plateau, seemed quite reassuring. To Dr. Richard, for example, good, an excellent graph, he said. He reckoned that the disease had reached what he had called a ceiling, and from here on it could only decrease. He ascribed this to Castel's new serum, which had indeed achieved some unexpected success. Old Castel did not contradict him, but felt that one could not predict anything for certain, since the history of epidemics shows that they could flare up again unexpectedly. The prefecture had for a long time wanted to appease the public anxieties, something that the plague had not allowed it to do, and was deciding to get the medical experts together for a report on the topic when Dr. Richard, too, was carried off by the plague, just as the epidemic reached a plateau. Though this case, after all, proved nothing, it was impressive, and the authorities, confronted by it, slipped back into pessimism with as little justification as they had first welcomed Richard's optimism. Castel, for his part, was content to prepare his serum as conscientiously as he could. There was only one public place that was not transformed into a hospital or an isolation facility, and if the prefecture was still given immunity, it was because they had to keep one place where people could meet. But on the whole, because of the relative stability of the epidemic at this time, the organization that Rio provided proved sufficient. The doctors and assistants, who were undertaking exhausting tasks, did not have to contemplate still greater efforts. They merely had to continue the superhuman work in a regular manner, one may say. The pulmonary forms of the infection that had already appeared now multiplied in every part of the town, as though the wind were lighting and fanning flames in people's chests. The sufferers died much more quickly, vomiting blood. The degree of contagion The degree of contagion threatened to be greater with this new form of the epidemic, though opinions of specialists had always been contradictory on this point. Meanwhile, for maximum safety, health workers continued to breathe through masks of disinfected gauze. In any case, one would have expected the disease to spread, but since the number of cases of the bubonic plague was falling, the figures stayed level. However, there might be other reasons for anxiety because of increasing difficulties in getting food supplies. Speculators were involved, and vital necessities unobtainable on the ordinary market were being offered at huge prices. Poor families consequently found themselves in a very difficult situation, while the rich lacked practically nothing. Because of the efficient impartiality which it brought to its administration, the plague should have worked for greater equality among our fellow citizens through the normal interplay of egoism, but in fact it heightened the feeling of injustice in the hearts of our men. Of course, no one could fault the equality of death, but it was not an equality that anybody wanted. The poor who suffered in this way from hunger thought with greater nostalgia than ever of neighboring towns and villages where life was free and bread was cheap. Since they could not be properly nourished, they had the rather unreasonable feeling that they should have been allowed to leave. So much so that someone eventually devised a slogan that you could read sometimes on the walls, or which at other times was shouted at the prefect when he went past. Bread or air. Bread or air. The ironic phrase was a signal for the demonstrations that were rapidly suppressed, though no one doubted their seriousness. Naturally, the newspapers followed the order that they had been given to be optimistic at any cost. Reading them, you would think that the main characteristic of the situation was the moving example of calm and courage shown by the people. But in a town shut in on itself, where nothing could remain secret, no one had any illusions about the example given by the population. And to get a correct notion of the calm courage in question, one only had to go to a place of quarantine or one of the isolation camps that the authorities had set up. As it happened, the narrator was busy elsewhere and did not have this experience, so we can only quote the evidence provided by Thoreau. In his notebooks, Thoreau describes a visit that he made with Rambert to the camp situated in the municipal stadium. This stadium stands almost at the gates of town, having on one side a street which the trams pass, and on the other some waste ground which extends as far as the edge of the plateau on which the town is built. Normally, it's surrounded by high concrete walls, and it was enough to put sentries at the four entrances to make escape difficult. In the same way, these walls prevented curious people from causing a nuisance to those unfortunates who were placed in quarantine. On the other hand, the latter could hear the trams passing all day long, and guess from the noises that they brought with them when it was time for people to go or leave to work. In this way, they were informed that the life from which they were excluded continued a few meters away from them, and that the concrete walls separated two worlds as foreign as one another, as if they had been on different planets. The day that Thoreau and Rambert chose to go to the stadium was a Sunday afternoon. They were accompanied by Gonzales, the football player, whom Rambert had discovered, and who eventually agreed to manage supervision in the stadium on a rota system. Rambert was present. Rambert was to present him to the camp administrator. When they met, Gonzales had told the two men that this was the time when he used to get dressed to start his match, in the days before the plague. Now that the sports grounds had been requisitioned, it was no longer possible, and Gonzales felt and looked entirely at a loose end. This was one of the reasons why he had not accepted a job as supervisor, why he had accepted this job as supervisor, as long as he only had to work weekends. The sky was half covered in clouds, and Gonzales, sniffing the air, regretfully observed that this weather, neither rainy nor hot, was just right for a good match. He recalled as best he could the smell of the embrocation in the dressing rooms, the rickety stands, the brightly colored jerseys on the tawny pitch, and the halftime lemons or lemonade that would tickle dry throats with 1,000 refreshing bubbles. Thoreau notes, moreover, that throughout the whole journey, through the run-down streets of the working-class quarters, the player was continually kicking pebbles that lay in his path. He tried to send them straight into drainage holes, and when he succeeded, he would say 1-0. When he had finished his cigarette, he spat the butt out in front of him and tried to drop kick it. Some children who were playing near the stadium kicked a ball toward the group as they were passing, and Gonzalez took the trouble to send it neatly back to them. Finally, they entered the stadium. The stands were full of people, and the field was covered with several hundred red tents, inside which one could see from a distance bedding in bundles. The stands had been retained so that the internees could take shelter if it was hot or raining. They were just obliged to go back to their tents at sunset. Under the stands there were shower rooms, which had been refurbished, and the players' old dressing rooms, which had been transformed into offices and infirmaries. Most of the internees were in the stands, while some others were wandering around along the touchlines. A few were crouching at the entrance to their tents, looking vaguely around them. In the stands, many were slumped down, apparently waiting for something. "What do they do all day?" Thoreau asked Rambert. "Nothing." Almost all of them were empty-handed, with their arms hanging by their sides. The vast assemblage of men was curiously silent. "In the early days, you couldn't hear yourself speak here," said Rambert. "But as the time goes by, they talk less and less." If one is to believe his notes, Thoreau understood them and imagined them, in the beginning, piled into their tents, kicking their heels and scratching their bellies, shouting their anger and their fear whenever they found a willing ear. But as soon as the camp became overpopulated, there were fewer and fewer willing ears. There was nothing left for it but to be quiet and watchful. Indeed, there was a certain wariness that fell out of the gray but luminous sky and onto the red camp. Yes, they all looked suspicious. Since they had been separated from the rest, this was not unreasonable, but they had the faces of those who are looking for reasons and who are afraid. Each of those, Thoreau looked and had vacant eye, and all appeared to be suffering from a general separation from everything that made up their lives. Since they could not always be thinking about death, they thought about nothing. They were taking a holiday. But the worst thing, as Thoreau wrote, is that these people are forgotten, and they know it. Their acquaintances have forgotten them because they are thinking about other things, and that is quite understandable. And as for those who love them, they have also forgotten them, because they must be exhausting themselves in appeals and schemes to get them out. The more they think about getting them out, the less they think about the person to be got out, and that too is normal. And when it comes down to it, you realize that no one is really capable of thinking of anyone else, even in the worst misfortune, because thinking about someone really means thinking about that person minute by minute, not being distracted by anything, not housework, not a fly passing, not meals, not an urge to scratch oneself. But there are always flies and itches, and this is why life is hard to live, and these people know that very well. The administrator, coming back toward them, told them that Monsieur Othon was asking to see them. He led Gonzalez into his office, and then took them towards a corner of the stands where Othon, who was sitting apart from the rest, got up to greet them. He was still dressed in the same way and wore the same stiff collar. Thoreau only noticed that tufts of hair at his temples were far more bristly, and that one of his shoelaces was undone. The magistrate seemed tired, and did not look at the visitors directly in the face. He said that he was pleased to see them, and that he begged them to thank Rio for what he had done. The others said nothing. "I hope," the magistrate said after a while, "that Philippe did not suffer too much." This was the first time that Thoreau had heard him call his son by his name and understood that something had changed. The sun was sinking behind the horizon, and between two clouds its rays shone sideways into the stands, lighting their faces with gold. No, Thoreau said. No, he didn't really suffer. When they left, the magistrate went on staring in the direction of the sun. They went to say goodbye to Gonzales, who was studying a supervision rota. The football player laughed as he shook hands with them. At least I've seen the dressing rooms again, he said. That's something, anyway. Shortly afterwards, the administrator was showing Thoreau and Rambert out when a very large crackling sound was heard in the stands. Then the loudspeakers, which in better times had served to introduce the teams or declare the results of the game, announced in a very tinny voice that the internees should go back to their tents and that the evening meal could be distributed. Slowly the men left the stands and went back to their tents, dragging their feet. When all of them were back, 2 small electric cars, the kind of which you see in railway stations, traveled between the tents carrying huge pots. The men held out their hands. 2 ladles were plunged into 2 of the pots and emerged to unload the contents into tin plates. The car drove on, and the process was repeated at the next tent. It's scientific, Thoreau told the administrator. Yes, he replied with satisfaction as they shook hands. It's scientific. Dusk was falling and the sky had cleared. The camp was bathed in a soft, clear light. In the quiet of the evening, sounds of spoons and plates could be heard on all sides. Bats flitted around above the tents and suddenly vanished. A tram screeched on its points on the other side of the wall. Poor Judge, muttered Thoreau as they went through the gates. Something should be done for him, but how can one help a judge?